Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of Hilaal Live. Thanks for watching us on channel 347. I'm your host, Luqman Shadrack. It's another legal edition, and over the last couple of weeks, we've been covering the marital regime in South Africa. Today's topic, out of community of property, is what we're discussing. And back in studio is our legal eagle, attorney Whalied Said. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I suppose the legal eagle's been going on for years and years. Eh? I think
it's an old saying. I don't know where it comes from.
Exactly,
but it's been around. Yeah.
But thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I think it's been very informative over the last couple of weeks. You're explaining the various contracts that people wanting to get married can enter into. Today, out of community of property. Now, when we chat about out of community of property, and let's chat without accrual first as well.
Yeah.
What makes this appealing to some couples, especially in the context of Sharia?
So, I think as we've mentioned in some of the previous episodes, the Muslim marriage with its Sharia principles has always been regarded as being very similar to out of community of property.
Yeah.
And the essence of that is that what belongs to the woman belongs to the woman, and what belongs to the man belongs to the man. You know, so in that respect, it is regarded as being sort of in line with Sharia principle.
Right.
Now, the benefits or the attractiveness of that process can be for different reasons. One of the primary reasons for people to use out of community of property is to protect one another, for example, especially when you're dealing with a spouse that is involved in business and, you know, there's an element of risk. You don't want to put your family assets or your wife's assets or your husband's assets at risk by being married in community of property. So if anything goes wrong, they can come after anybody, right? So by being married out of community of property, it means that your estates are separated, right? The wife has her own assets and liabilities, and the husband has his own assets and liabilities. Don't confuse that with the fact that you can still do things jointly. And I think a lot of people are concerned about that, or don't consider that as an option, and therefore they go, well, we must do in community because then we can share. You can still share when you're married out of community of property. You can still buy immovable property together and co-own a house or co-own a business or something like that, but you're still protecting your family assets outside of that.
Of course. Thanks for that. And I think it's really important that people understand why we're discussing this as well. Out of community of property without accrual, I mean, how does this regime ensure that both spouses retain complete ownership of their own assets and, more importantly, their debt going into a marriage?
Okay. So, obviously, when we're talking about marriage in or out of community of property with or without accrual, these are matrimonial property regimes that are legislated in South Africa. So, you are protected by law, right? Now, whatever regime you are in, since we're talking about out of community of property, when you get married, you have what is called an antenuptial contract, and that is the document that determines that you are married out of community of property. That antenuptial contract, which is registered at the deeds office, will, for example, state that there will be no community of profit or loss. There will be no community, the assets will be kept separate.
Right.
So your protection is actually registered at the deeds office, where it says that whatever belongs to the husband is the husband's, whatever belongs to the wife is the wife, and that applies to both assets and liabilities.
Okay, all right. And this happens prior to the marriage?
Correct. So when you are planning on getting married, the antenuptial contract has to be signed and notarized prior to your marriage ceremony being conducted.
Okay. And how long does this take? I mean, so that we can give couples an idea.
So that process itself can take a day.
Oh, okay.
Right, because you can phone an attorney this morning, and if he's got availability, he can see you this afternoon. Have your antenuptial contract done, signed, notarized, and you can get married tomorrow.
Okay.
Right? Registration of the antenuptial contract is a different story.
Okay.
That takes about another month or two. Legally, it has to be done within 3 months.
Okay.
Right? But it doesn't need to be registered prior to your marriage ceremony. It only needs to be notarized prior to your marriage ceremony. And then what we do is we give a letter from the notary confirming that an antenuptial contract has been signed and is in the process of being registered. and that is sufficient for any marriage officer to conclude the wedding ceremony and indicate on his marriage certificate book or marriage register, that the marriage will be out of community of property.
Okay, great. We're chatting to Brother Whalied Said, who's an attorney, and tonight's topic, out of community of property. We're discussing with accrual, without accrual, and you can decide prior to entering into a marriage which one works for you. Brother Whalied, what makes the out of, well, we chatted about the outer community, what makes this appealing for certain couples, and you just said about, whether you're in a business and protecting your assets and liabilities. But how does this regime, benefit both spouses? I mean, sometimes this can be an emotional sort of conversation one needs to have, and somebody may say, oh, but, don't you trust me? Or, don't you want to get married? Or do you not want to, hoping that this is not going to last forever? These are real concerns that people have, right?
For sure. That can actually be looked at as another old adage, some people see the cup as half full and some people see the cup as half empty. So whether you look at it as in the case of don't you love me or I'm doing this because I love you.
Right.
It depends on the person and their attitude. And, right now we're in the middle of 10 days of activism or 16 days of activism for gender-based violence. And, other than physical violence, one of the common problems that we have is women's assets being taken from them.
Yeah.
And a classic case is divorced, widowed woman. She's got her own property. Maybe she inherited it. Maybe she bought it herself. It's irrelevant. Now she gets married again. The only way that a woman like that should consider getting married is out of community of property so that those assets can be protected, because now she gets married to someone, their kids conflict, and 6 months later they divorce. It happens all the time. If you got married in community of property, suddenly that house that you owned, you now have to give half of that house to that spouse who you've known for 6 months, possibly even less, even if it's more. It doesn't matter. Now you're losing that house or half of that house, which you might have worked very hard to leave as a legacy for your children.
Gotcha.
And now suddenly you are being abused.
That's a real situation. These
very,
situations
very real.
happened.
I've had numerous occasions or cases like that come across my desk where, and sadly, there's almost nothing that you can do because you got married in community of property, and that is a consequence of it.
Wow.
And that is why it's so important to consider this out of community of property, because you need to protect your assets, especially if you're going in with assets that you already own.
Gotcha. If you look at the topic today as well, what is the primary benefits of financial independence in this regime? I mean, and who would this arrangement suit best?
Okay. Financial independence is obviously a very vast topic, and one cannot stress enough how important it is for someone to be financially independent, simply for the simple case of we don't know what life holds or what's in store. Very simple verse in the Quran, wa makaru wa makarallah wallahu khairul makirin. We plan, Allah makes plans, but Allah is the best of planners. So I might now plan that I'm going to have this business and this house and all of these things, and suddenly my spouse gets taken away or I get taken away. We don't know. So it's important that whether you're a man or a woman, you should be able to stand on your own 2 feet. If you have a husband that doesn't want you to work and is capable of providing for you, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but you should still be capable of standing on your own 2 feet. And if you are staying home, there's nothing wrong with saying, well, if I'm going to stay home and look after the house, then maybe you can contribute X amount and I can still buy my own property and I have a rental income. So if anything happens to you, I can still have something to fall back onto. Or if anything happens to us, that little bit of financial independence can go a very long way in keeping a woman protected.
I mean, case in point, we had COVID where both men and women lost their jobs, and you were left
Easily.
with either no job in a household or one spouse having a job, and the other had to just, bite their teeth a little bit or bite their tongue a little bit and just
Correct.
sabr
Yeah,
before something came up, or start a business and things like that. And this is what the protection you're talking about.
correct. Because again, if something like that happens, and Allah forbid that it doesn't happen again, then there should be at least some form of protective mechanism in. Because if both spouses lose their house, or sorry, lose their jobs or lose their income, the banks don't consider that.
Yeah.
You know, all that they want is their money. They're not going to go, oh, sorry, you know, don't worry, we'll give you 2 years to pay. We all wish that, but it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right? So if we can protect ourselves, then we should. And that's one of the mechanisms that we protect ourselves from, making sure when we enter into a marriage, we do it with the proper contracts in place, with a proper understanding, where both parties have assets or intend to have lots of assets. Who doesn't have big dreams when they start out?
Of course.
Right? So lay your foundation properly, and then it's easy to build on from that.
I think great advice. And this is what we all look for when entering into a marriage. And it's wedding season coming up, as they say, in most parts of the country.
Yeah.
So these are things to genuinely consider. Go and sit down with an attorney, a lawyer, and find out how best you could draw up a contract to protect each individual.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. We're chatting to Brother Whalied Said, our legal eagle in studio. Today's topic is out of community of property. If you have any questions or concerns, you're welcome to email me at lukman@hilaal.tv, and I'll pass it on to Brother Whalied as well. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we chat a bit more about this very important topic. Thanks for watching us on Hilaal Live. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hilaal Live. I'm your host, Lukman Shadrack. Thanks for watching us as we continue our topic of out of community of property with our attorney in studio, Whalied Said. Whalied, jazakallah so much coming into studio. So we chatted about out of community, some of the legalities with regards to, or the possibilities, what could happen without entering into a contract. So which means that if you don't enter into a contract with accrual or without accrual, there are consequences that could face down the line. One of those consequences, which is real as well, death and divorce. You know, those are two real things that could possibly affect a marriage, and especially if you don't have a will. That could even complicate things a lot further. Chat to us a little bit about that.
Right. So if you've got married in community of property, you didn't do a contract, whether with or without accrual, you simply went to a marriage officer and you got married, or you took your nikah certificate and you took it to Home Affairs to get that registered without an antenuptial contract, you would then by default be regarded as being married in community of property. So when there's a divorce or when there's a death, right, the first thing that happens, whether you have a will or not, right, the first thing that happens is half of your estate goes to your spouse.
Okay.
Right. So if you intended that this house must be for this child, or I've bought this house, leave it as a legacy for my kids and things like that, then that won't happen, because half will go to the spouse. And if the spouse is not an understanding person, then he will go, no, but I'm entitled to that by law, you know, because people go where the money is. They don't necessarily follow Sharia.
Of course.
And that unfortunately happens far too often. You know, so that's one of the biggest problems and consequences of not having an antenuptial contract when you're looking at being married in terms of civil law and death, right? The same applies to divorce. So when you're getting divorced, automatically your spouse is entitled to half of your asset. Right? I touched on that a few minutes ago, where we said you get married, 6 months later you get divorced, and you've got to give your spouse half of the house that you've worked for 20 years for. Of course. You know, it's heartbreaking for some people because you've built that legacy for your kids, and now you've got to part with half of it. And that's probably the saddest consequence of not having an antenuptial contract when you are engaging in a civil marriage.
Okay. So let's move on with accrual. You know, how are individual estates calculated at the start and maybe at the end of the marriage under the accrual system?
Okay. So when you're doing your antenuptial contract with accrual, right, one of the clauses in the contract will be a clause identifying the value of your estate at the time of entering into that marriage.
Okay.
So that value is what that value is.
Right.
If you're entering into a marriage and let's say you're both just out of varsity, you both just got jobs, and now you're starting, that value will be zero, right? You may even have a house or you may even have a car, but you can still decide to, by agreement, to make that value zero. I'm not talking about the case where I'm hiding my house and my car and I put it in as zero, right? So you start off at zero or you start off at whatever the value is. Then on termination, now whether that is by death or divorce is irrelevant. On termination, the value is determined by current value.
Market value.
Market value.
Okay.
And for me, that's where the biggest problem lies in. Not so much in the case of death, right? The issue with death is more of a Sharia compliant issue. The issue with divorce is more of a bitter issue. Because what you find is that when you're in the middle of a divorce, there's generally a complete lack of trust. So if I come and I say, my estate is only worth 5 million, no, he's lying. And now you have the lawyers going back and forth, asking for years and years and years of bank statements and financial reports and audit reports and all of these things, because the one party doesn't believe the other party in terms of what their final value is of their estate. Because the long and the short of that is that the accrual, I mean, we didn't even go into the definition, but what accrual basically does is that it takes the value, the start value. So if your start values were zero, and on termination, the husband's value is 5 million and the wife's value is 2.5 million, then the difference in value will be split between the two.
I see.
Right? And that is where the arguments come in, because now the wife will say, no, his estate is not worth 5 million, it's worth 10 million, which means I must get 5 million and not 2.5 million, for example.
Gotcha.
And that's where the fighting starts. And we've had divorces that's dragged on for years because they can't agree on an accrual value.
Sure.
And in the end, had you taken 500,000 and less 5 years ago and invested it, you would have had more than what you would have settled for now. But people don't think that way.
Of course.
When you get into that battleground of divorce, it's sometimes just such a hectic battle and everybody loses.
Okay. We're chatting to Whalied Said around the out of community of property with accrual and without accrual, in terms of contract that you can enter into prior to your marriage as well. I want to pose a question to you as well in terms of, can you provide maybe examples of how the regime fosters maybe joint wealth creation while respecting their individual contribution?
So when we're dealing with out of community of property with the accrual, it's sort of a middle ground attempt between out of community and in community, right? So whatever happens, if I invest in properties and my wife invests in properties, each will retain their own property. So I have my own portfolio. So if anything happens, I don't have to give half of my assets to my wife and she doesn't have to give half of her assets to me. However, because we've worked hard together, the accrual system then allows for you to share in that joint effort, assuming it was a joint effort. It could also be a separate effort, but that would just be assumptions. Obviously, every circumstance differs between couples.
Of course.
So we can only make assumptions on that. But that is the theory behind it. Let's put it that way. The theory behind it is that whatever they've worked on together during the time of their marriage, that they've built up, they get to share in that equally.
Okay. So you mentioned a very important point as well, that sometimes spouses may not be too honest about their assets. So this can be very complex and this can, come with certain challenges as well. Have you had situations like that? And did this drag on forever? Who gets involved besides the lawyers? Is there anyone else that gets involved to try and determine this figure?
Very complicated, right? So if there's a dispute with regards to the figure, other than the attorneys or the advocates that get involved, if it's a high court matter, you would possibly also need to get a forensic auditor involved to do a forensic audit on someone's financial circumstances, and that would include, for example, looking at all their SARS submissions, looking at their full financial history, And that's happened. We've had people asking, and those things cost money.
Yeah. So who foots the bill there? That would be part of the whole dispute?
That becomes part of the dispute, because at the end of the day, if the court makes a determination and says, well, he said he was worth 5 million, the forensic audit shows that he's worth 5 million, you didn't believe him, so you pay the bill. Or maybe the court feels sorry and say, no, each party pay their own costs. But it really depends on the circumstances of a matter. Often people can't afford it, so they just avoid it and end up settling, but not after a lot of back and forth, which is unnecessary and expensive.
Yeah, just more headaches with regards to what you're going through at the moment. Well, thanks very much. Very quickly, just to run through the best solution, someone entering into a marriage, go and seek legal advice in terms of drawing up a contract.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Critical.
And how long does that process take, just to refresh our audience's memory?
Well, getting advice can be fairly simple. You can do it in a day, and even getting an antenuptial contract signed and notarized can happen in a day or two, depending on the availability of the attorney. And that needs to be done prior to your marriage ceremony taking place. Registration of the ANC can take up to 3 months afterwards, and that's fine, as long as it's been notarized prior to your wedding ceremony.
We're not talking about the political party. We're talking about the anti-nuptial contract, with accrual, without accrual, because that has certain legalities as well. And I mean, you want to enter into a marriage where both parties are significantly happy and, they're okay with moving forward in their marriage.
Absolutely. Happy and protected.
Absolutely.
I think what's critical is that people understand that this is a means of protection.
Rather
and not
than
a means
mistrust.
of mistrust or hiding, or I don't want to share with you. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean you can't share.
Gotcha.
If you're married out of community, but you need to protect.
Brilliant. Whalied, thanks so much. Have a great afternoon. It's almost that time of the year, and I'm sure you are inundated before you take some much needed rest.
Absolutely. Shukran to you and to the viewers out there.
Jazakallah so much for your time. There we go. Whalied Said from Said Attorneys. If you have any queries, you're welcome to email me or contact them directly at info@saidattorneys.co.za. It's all that we have for you from the team in Cape Town, Sohail Barnes and myself, Luqman Shadrack. Have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum.